She was only 14, a bright young girl walking home on a sunny day, her dreams and future ahead of her. But she never made it back. When her body was discovered, buried in a shallow grave miles from her home, the evidence led to one man, Burton Abbott. Was he a cunning killer or a man caught in a web of circumstantial evidence? Join me as we uncover the shocking twists, courtroom drama, and the haunting moral dilemma behind one of California's most infamous murder cases. You won't believe how it ends. Burton Wilbur Abbott, nicknamed Bud, was born on February 8, 1928 to parents Harold Mark Abbott and Elsie Bell Moore Abbott in Portland, America. Abbott was born a year before the great stock market crash that started the Great Depression. 8 years prior, women in America gained the right to vote, and only 2 years earlier was the year that saw a great flu pandemic ravage the entire earth, causing millions of deaths. Harold worked as a laborer on a fruit farm, and in 1917, he enlisted in the Army. Elsie was a 19-year-old divorcee when she married Harold in 1921. Harold was 10 years older than her. She had 2 sisters and a brother. Her brother's name was Wirt Emmett Moore. Elsie worked as an aircraft upholsterer at the Alameda, California Naval Air Station. In 1946, when Burton became 18 years old, he enlisted in the Army, where he contracted tuberculosis. After undergoing surgery to remove half of an infected lung, he was honorably discharged. Georgia Evelyn Shorts Ruby was born on the 4th of August, 1921 in Kansas, America, to parents Robert Shorch and Marie Sophia Damel-Scorch. She was the last of 7 children. Georgia met Burton at the Livermore Veterans Hospital, where he was staying due to his illness. 14 months after enlisting in the Army, Burton goes back home to his family. Georgia and Burton were married in 1948. They moved to California, where they lived, and they welcomed their son Christopher 3 years later in September 1951. They lived on a large piece of land which originally belonged to George's father, however was partly owned by a friend of his named Lloyd Snyder, who relinquished his share to George's brother after being convicted of murder in their family cabin in Trinity County. Snyder reportedly shot a man dead after an altercation. He dismembered the body with a saw and stuffed the body parts in Hessian jute sacks and buried them on the property. Only 4 days to his incarceration at San Quentin, Snyder transferred the deed to George's brother. Sadly, his father Harold would die 1 year later when Burton was 24 years old, and Elsie, Burton's mother, lived with them. In 1953, at the age of 25, Burton registered at the University of California to study accounting. Georgia worked at a beauty shop, and she was also president of the Oakland branch of the State Cosmetologists Association. Burton had been a student at University of California for 2 years when he was arrested for kidnapping and murder. 1955 is by no means an uneventful year for the world. It's the year that sees the passing of the world's greatest genius Albert Einstein, the resignation of a great British leader Winston Churchill. There are talks amongst several nations to bring an end to the Cold Wars and decolonization. The first microwave oven is introduced into America. Events that year would leave a critical time stamp in the evolution of Black history. It's the year Rosa Parks, in protest against the segregation of whites and blacks on buses, refused to give her seat up to a white man. The end of that year began the first largest demonstration against segregation in America, led by Martin Luther King. It would last for a whole year. Stephanie Bryan lived at 131 Alvarado Road, Berkeley, California with her family. Her father was a radiologist. Stephanie went to Willard Junior High School. She was a highly academical top student in her school. She was described by those who knew her as timid and very quiet. The Bryans were planning a summer trip, and she was looking forward to it. She started to write a letter to a friend detailing her intended trip with her family. On a spring Thursday morning, it's the 28th of April, Stephanie got up to prepare for school. She wore a blue sweater and a blue skirt. She said goodbye to her mother and father and left for school like she had done so many times before. Unbeknownst to her parents, they would never see her again alive. She was 14. Willard Middle School was the first of its kind in California when established in 1910. In 1955, Stephanie's disappearance rocked the whole city, as the Berkeley area of California wasn't known for violence. The incident drew a lot of attention, even involving the FBI, and to date remains one of Berkeley's most infamous murders. As school came to a close that afternoon, Stephanie would head home. It's 3:15 p.m. Along Ashby Avenue, she meets her friend Mary and Stuart from college, and they walk together east on Ashby Avenue in the direction of Claremont Hotel. They stop at an intersect near the corner of College Avenue. There they make a short visit to the public library. Then they continue walking down Ashby Avenue. They also visited a donut shop called Dream Fluff Donuts in the vicinity of the intersect of Ashby Avenue and College Avenue. They also visited the Elmwood Pet Shop. Stephanie bought a book about parakeets because she loved birds. They continued along Ashby Avenue until they approached the end of the road which connects at an intersect with Tunnel Road. Berkeley Tennis Club is at the intersect behind which stands the famous Claremont Hotel. A short distance from here is the grounds of the Claremont Hotel. It's 4 p.m. Here's Stephanie holding on her bag and some books parts ways with her friend. They say their goodbyes and Mary goes to her tennis lessons at the Berkeley Tennis Club, while Stephanie cuts through the car park of the hotel, a route she'd taken for many years. She takes a shortcut, which is 5 minutes to the top of her street. It was the last time she would ply this route. Beyond the car park about 100 yards away was her front doorstep. Sadly, she would never make it home. Her parents waited patiently for their daughter's return, as they had done so many times before. When it was 4 p.m., Stephanie's mother stood outside, looking down the road, hoping to catch a glimpse of her daughter. Sadly, she would never show up. Worried, Stephanie's mother, Mary, called up her daughter's school and then mothers of her daughter's friend. Around 4:15 that afternoon, when Stephanie still hadn't returned home, she called her husband Charles, who rushed home, and he made the phone call to the police and reported his daughter missing. A search party was launched to find her without avail. For the next 2 days, they canvassed the area around the hotel, but couldn't find her. 4 days after her disappearance, a textbook belonging to Stephanie was found on Franklin Canyon Road in Contra Costa County. It had rained a few days earlier. However, the book was bone dry. Together with statements from people saying they saw a girl forced into a car and being beaten by the driver, these were the only clues. A little over 2 weeks from Stephanie's disappearance, Georgia had been in the basement of her Alameda, California home she shared with Burton when she stumbled upon a cardboard box. She was known to love partying and had been searching for a costume she could wear to a party. Curious, she opens the box and finds a red purse among some of her husband's old clothes. These were clothes he wore usually when he was up at their family cabin in the mountains in Trinity County. The cabin was a gift from her parents. She searches the purse and finds an identification card which belonged to Stephanie Bryan. Georgia heads back upstairs to the living room where her visits had sat. She asks her husband Burton if this ID was that of the missing schoolgirl from 2 weeks ago. Burton had suggested they could belong to a friend of the family. However, one of their guests present suggested she go to the police. So, Georgia contacted the police to report her findings. The following day, the police arrive at the home of Georgia and Burton Abbott. They find Burton's behavior quite odd, in that the disappearance of the young teenager was dominating the headlines, and he sat quietly solving a crossword puzzle unperturbed that the evidence relating to the case was found in his basement. The police conduct a search of their entire property. They dig in the basement and find there buried underneath the dirt a pair of glasses, a bra, and books. These all belong to Stephanie Bryan. They also find amongst her possessions her unfinished letter to her friend. A 27-year-old Burton was taken down to the police station for questioning. Christopher was 4 years old. The police asked Butron where he'd been on the 28th of April. He told the police he drove that day to their family cabin 300 miles away in the mountains in Trinity County. He said that he'd been there the whole day and returned 3 days later on Sunday. On learning of these facts, the police immediately launched a search party around the Georgia and Burton's cabin. They were becoming frustrated at the lack of evidence when one of the examiners approached a local to borrow his bloodhounds to aid their search of the area, and on the 20th of July, 1955, the police made a grim discovery. The dogs lead them to a leg sticking out of the ground still wearing a shoe. Stephanie's body is found lying in a shallow grave about 100 yards from their cabin. Her hands were in front of her face, and there were multiple fractures in her skull, as well as 2 holes about 2 inches in diameter. The medical examiner concluded the head injuries were the cause of her death. Upon the discovery of Stephanie's body, the charges against Burton are kidnap, rape, and murder. Further evidence of the attack: her nylon panties were wrapped in a knot around her neck. This meant she'd been strangled, and there were deep ligature marks in her neck. Her clothes were intact, except for her bra. Stephanie's body was so severely decomposed that it wasn't possible to determine if sexual assault had been involved. It was determined, however, she was dead for a while before she was buried, as her body was already in a state of rigor mortis before being buried. Burton attended his accounting classes at University of California in Berkeley. He used to visit a donut shop only a few blocks from Willard Middle School. Stephanie was known to have purchased pastries from this shop. Witness statements would soon riddle holes in his testimony, as witness accounts would confirm they saw Burton at the same donut shop around 3 o'clock on the day Stephanie went missing. His 1949 Chevrolet sedan was identified driving through Ashby Avenue that same day. Other witness statements testified to seeing a man resembling Burton's description driving on Tunnel Road with a girl in the car. A girl with a very frightened look on her face was in the car, and the driver was seen beating her on the head. Further witness statements testified to seeing Burton near the cabin on Friday after Stephanie's disappearance. He was also seen eating and drinking at a tavern not too far from the cabin. A friend of his testified he was acting strangely, and that Burton didn't allow him to enter his cabin that day. The police also learned that Burton's journey to his Alameda home in California was through Franklin Canyon Road. It's the following morning Stephanie's textbook is found. Further investigation showed Burton had traveled along Franklin Canyon Road the next day, evidenced by a receipt for fuel at a gas station near where Stephanie's book was found. First, he claimed he'd been out to buy tires, and that he didn't buy any as he couldn't state where he went to buy tires. Burton did, however, have classes scheduled between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. that day at the university campus, which was 12 miles away. The forensic examiners searched Burton's car. Amongst the evidence they discovered was 2 strands of hair matching Stephanie's. There were fibers found which, when examined, matched the fibers of the clothes Stephanie had worn that day. When the mat in the trunk of the car was examined, there was no blood found on the surface fibers. However, investigations showed there was blood beneath the fibers at the surface. This told investigators that the mat had been washed. They find a pair of mud-encrusted boots. The forensic investigators examined the mud on the soles of the boots, and they matched the soil 9 inches below the surface in Stephanie's grave. The side of the cabin was also combed through by crime scene investigators, and a rat's nest is found with fragments of blood-stained cleansing tissue. The police asked Burton to describe in detail the route he traveled to the cabin. Burton gave details evading Sacramento. But when the police questioned his brother and his sister-in-law, they told the police Abbott told them he stopped at Sacramento while driving up to join them at the cabin. Burton changes his statement. He then stated he did drive through Sacramento as he was heading to an office. And when asked for directions of this office, he changed his statement yet again and said he was unable to find the office in question. Burton began crying, professing his innocence. He denied knowing how Stephanie's belongings ended up in his house and how her body ended up buried in a shallow grave on his property. He submitted to a lie detector test. Under Section 209 of the Penal Code, Burton was facing 2 life sentences at a minimum without the possibility of parole for kidnapping an individual who was then subject to bodily harm. Abbott testified at his trial that he left their home in Alameda at 10:45 a.m., drove to his wife's place of work to say goodbye to her before driving to Sacramento. Then on towards the cabin, stopping at a restaurant at 3 p.m., where he was served by a waitress in her mid to late 30s, having dusty blonde hair, and then at an inn called Wildwood Inn at 8:30 p.m. However, his testimony conflicted with testimony of other witnesses who put him in Oakland at 1:30 and his wife's place of work at 2:30 p.m. The restaurant testified they didn't serve food at that time of the day, nor do they have a waitress fitting Burton's description. And the inn owners also testified that Burton hadn't been at the inn either. Burton had said in the weeks prior to discovering the wallet in his basement, it had been used as a polling booth and could explain how her personal items were found in his home. However, at the time of his interrogation, the police were skeptical as they were aware the garage was used for the polling station, not his basement. His defense argued he couldn't have buried the victim and her belongings due to having had several ribs and half his lung removed due to the tuberculosis he contracted at the Army. However, the doctor who had treated him at the Livermore Veterans Hospital testified to the contrary, stating that Burton was far from a partial cripple, as he had recovered well. He also testified that only a few days after Stephanie's disappearance, he showed up at the hospital again, begging desperately for any procedure at all. The doctor said they refused any treatment and sent him home. Burton maintained his innocence and said he was being framed. Initially, they had suspected Snyder was responsible given his closeness to the family and the fact he was out on parole earlier that same month. However, he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Throughout the trial, Burton's manner was calm, cool, and collected. The defense put Burton on the stand, where he gave a clear description of the event as they unfolded on the day of Stephanie's disappearance. However, when cross-examined by the prosecution in sheer contrast, he didn't seem to recall anything. He just kept answering, "I don't remember," or "I don't know." When asked why he didn't call a relative, he replied, because he didn't know their number. When asked to describe his usual route to school, he gave one which seemed to deliberately circumvent Willard Middle School, which is where Stephanie went to school. He was asked again to provide his usual route to school, then he provided one which took him by the school, but when asked which one was his usual route, he said both of them. The cross-examiner for the prosecution was clearly exasperated by now. After further questioning, he began to puncture holes in Burton's testimony. In pointing out the inconsistencies with the timeline he gave with respect to saying he was in certain places at certain time which weren't true. The prosecution showed the knotted underwear. He untied it in front of the court, showing where it had been slashed 2 times with. An enraged Coakley repeatedly called Burton an unrepentant psychopath. Burton's attorneys argued the evidence was insufficient to deem Burton the killer. The trial lasted for 47 days. The jury deliberated for 7 days, before returning with the verdict of guilty. Burton's legal team contended there were a number of errors on the part of the judge and district attorney during his trial. They alleged that the Court of Alameda don't have territorial jurisdiction to hear his case. They substituted a juror during his trial. They erred in the admission of evidence and are guilty of prejudicial misconduct. Jurisdiction of kidnapping is controlled by the county in which the kidnapping occurred. This same applies for the offense of murder, where it was committed, or where the fatal injury was inflicted, or where the victim died, or where their body was found. While Stephanie was kidnapped from Berkeley in Alameda County, the evidence shows her death or murder hadn't occurred in Alameda County. In this situation, the court of either of these locations is the territorial jurisdiction. Being that Burton comes from Alameda County, and likely here conceived and connived to carry out his plan of kidnap and murder plot that would end the life of a victim. Therefore, the court concluded Alameda County, where his trial took place, was a suitable county legally to prosecute the defendant. It was found that one of the jurors worked in the same office as Burton's brother at the Alameda Naval Station, and before being selected for jury service had discussed the case with colleagues, expressing his opinions Burton was being framed. After being questioned in the judge's chambers, whilst it wasn't known the juror had been in communication with or knew Burton, he was removed due to his proximity to the defendant. Burton's legal team challenged the court, stating they had used knowledge of Burton's reaction during the initial interrogation as evidence during the trial. It was argued that as Burton's response when asked accusatory and other questions during his interrogation, and to which he replied, "I'm refusing to talk on the advice of my attorney," which is his legal right. Such inference that his remaining silent indicates his guilt isn't justified and is therefore inadmissible in court. As the court had admitted his responses and reactions to these questions into court as evidence, despite his responses clearly showing he acted upon the advice of his counsel, it was concluded the court had erred in admitting this knowledge as evidence. The evidence against Burton was overwhelming. The interrogation centered around the facts in regards to the evidence uncovered at his family home in Alameda and around their cabin in Trinity. So, it was ruled that whilst they admitted an error on their part, it didn't in any way affect the outcome of his trial. Thus, there was no validity in the accusations from Burton's team that the court had committed these actions with intentions to hurt his defense. At the end of the trial, Burton is charged with kidnapping and murder of Stephanie Bryan. Burton pled not guilty to both counts. His lawyer's motion for a new trial was denied. He was found guilty of kidnapping and murder in the first degree and was given the death penalty. On the first count of guilty, Elsie ran screaming out of the courtroom. On January 25, 1956, he was sentenced to death by gas chamber. After sentencing, Burton is incarcerated at the San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, awaiting execution. His lawyers fought hard and tirelessly to overturn his conviction up until the moment of his execution. On the day of Burton's execution, his attorney had appealed to the United States Court of Appeals, to no avail. His attorney had tried to contact the governor of California, who was at sea and unreachable by telephone. Unable to get in touch with the governor, he arranged for the appeal to broadcast over television. His attempts were successful. At 9:02 that morning, the governor granted a stay of execution by 1 hour, making the set time of Burton's execution 11 a.m. Immediately, they petitioned the Supreme Court, where he was found guilty and sentenced to death, to retry the case on the grounds of unlawful imprisonment. At 10:42, their writ was denied. At this point, Burton's brother Mark, who'd been watching the clock, began to cry. Their lawyers petitioned again, and at 10:50 a.m. again, their writ was denied. They go back to the governor at 11:12 a.m., who grants another hour's stay of execution. About 14 months after he was sentenced, on March 15, 1957, at precisely 11:14 a.m., Burton is led to the gas chamber. He was strapped to the chair. The silence in the room and the gas chamber was deafening. The executioner pulled the lever, and the clank could be heard like thunder. 16 pellets of sodium cyanide are released into a vat of sulfuric acid. The fumes created begin to fill the chamber where Burton is strapped. Burton takes a deep breath. He held it for as long as he could. Then he exhales forcefully, and with one massive breath, he gave up the ghost. Burton Abbott was dead at 29 years old. At this moment, the governor's secretary was still trying to reach the San Quentin warden. By the time the warden received news the governor had agreed to another stay, it was too late. Burton was dead. Elsie Abbott, Burton's mother, believed in her son's innocence until her death 50 years later. In the beginning of the investigations, the Abbott's household had been questioned in relation to the disappearance of Stephanie Bryan. The police learned that Elsie had in fact found the wallet belonging to Stephanie much earlier, but hadn't thought anything of it. She stated that her brother Wilbur, who was a truck driver, was responsible for this and was framing her son. Elsie took out an ad in the papers offering a reward for any information that could free her son. She would later present her evidence to the grand jury in hopes to clear her son's name after his death, but the jury refused to consider it. Elsie couldn't believe this was happening to her son. She stated her son wasn't physically capable of carrying a body or digging a grave. She said her son was murdered by the state of California. Elsie died in 2004 at the age of 100 years old. She never gave up. When interviewed by Keith Walker from Santa Rosa, an author writing a book on the event, she insisted it was her own brother who had planted the evidence which would frame her son for murder. During the trial, the prosecution had retorted, the clues which led to Burton were as a trail of corn. Could her brother have planted the trail also? This led to the title of Walker's book in 1995, A Trail of Corn. Burton had been evaluated by the psychiatrist at the medical facility at San Quentin, who asked him to admit to his crime and beg for mercy. But he replied, "Think of what it would do to my mother. She couldn't take it." After Burton's death, Georgia moved with their son to another state and changed her name. This was by far one of California's most shocking murder trials, creating such panic and excitement amongst the residents of California. For 2 years, the story made front-page news. This case marked a pivotal point in the judicial system. The controversy around a conviction purely based on circumstantial evidence alone, with nothing directly connecting Burton to Stephanie's murder. Emotions were extremely charged given the nature of this incident, and there was a campaign led by the tabloids convincing everyone of the Burton's guilt. They wanted the death penalty. A famous detective story writer, Earl Stanley Gardner, who created the Perry Mason series, was hired to give his opinions on the matter. He wrote an article for the paper every day analyzing the case. The team for the prosecution went as far as showing extremely graphic photos of the victim's body and waved her bra and panties in the courtroom, saying repeatedly, "Why?" From this, they were able to establish he was a sexual deviant. The prosecution displayed Stephanie's clothing, showing the courtroom the state of her clothes, which now had a bad smell and caused some of the courtroom to evacuate. The prosecution insisted Burton's kidnapped Stephanie because he wanted to rape her, and he killed her because she resisted. He stated rape was worse than death itself, and the death penalty was also a more humane way to die. Hence, the penalty for the crime should be death. According to federal law, once a petition is filed and refused by the judge, the attorney for the defense has 90 days to file for a writ of certiorari, which enables a court to review a case to see if there were any legal errors in the conviction. However, as Burton's date of execution was, and he was executed 2 weeks to this 90-day limit, it's contemplated Burton may have won an appeal and got a new trial.